Good morning from Los Angeles. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Alexandra Lieben. I'm the president of ASTINA, a network of Austrian scientists and scholars in North America. Founded in 2002, we are Austria's only independent network of scientists abroad. I would also like to thank the TU Wien, the Technical University Vienna, for co-sponsoring today's event. The title of today's talk is Resilience, Designing for Climate Change. In Los Angeles, we just went through apocalyptic wildfires. More than 16,000 structures burned, thousands more damaged, countless people displaced, and entire communities ripped apart. The economic loss to the region is estimated at $250 billion. That's a staggering number and makes it one of the costliest natural disasters in US history. To put this into perspective, according to the World Bank in 2023, Austria's GDP was $511 billion, so just about double that. Zooming out though, similar scenarios caused by floods, fires, storms play out across the globe, and more frequently than ever before. Climate change is the common denominator. The costs, both economic and human, are simply too high. But this is also a chance for visionary thinking. People mourn the loss of their homes, but even more so, they mourn the loss of their community. The human connection, the sense of belonging, the comfort, ease, and stability that only community can provide. Building codes, zoning laws, regulation, street design, infrastructure, outdated or not, landscape management standards, or the number of fire stations, they all play a role, but are not the focus of today's conversation. We're here to think about design from a community perspective. How do we rebuild places, not just homes? How do we build community for resilience? Let me briefly introduce our panelists, and we'll post the longer bios in the chat later on. Dana Bauer, partner and design principal at Elysian Landscapes, Los Angeles. As an architect, Dana's work is always focused on the ground as the greatest opportunity for unstructured urban experience and the meeting place of the natural and the constructed realms. Tina Gregoric de Kleva, professor at TU Wien, principal and co-founder of de Kleva-Gregoric Architects, Vienna, Austria, and Ljubljana, Slovenia. As a full professor and a practicing architect, Tina strategically intertwines design and research to address significant social and environmental issues. Julia Körner is founder of JK3D and JK Design and associate adjunct professor at the UCLA School of Arts and Architecture, Los Angeles. Julia is an award-winning Austrian designer working at the convergence of architecture, product, and fashion design, specializing in 3D printing. Andrea Leonardine Madden, AIA, is principal and founder, ALM Project, Los Angeles. Andrea's approach to architecture and design has been shaped by growing up and studying in Vienna, where the visual and performing arts are part of the daily discourse. A sensitivity to layers of time and meaning that accrue to places is a hallmark of her work, which is forged with an equal commitment to innovation. Mark Mack is Professor Emeritus at UCLA School of Architecture and Urban Design and former principal, Beatty and Mack Architects. As DJ Orange, Mark produces events on music and architecture in Southern California. Let's get to our conversation. We have to change the narrative. So change is inevitable if we want to become more climate resilient and sustainable. But how do we bring a public along that may have very different ideas? Andrea, what are your clients' expectations when they build or right now rebuild? What are their priorities? Can you convince them to build with resilience in mind?
Well, clients usually have a notion of where they want to go when they are building a new home, meaning they have a site, they have an approximate size in mind, a general look and feel. There are many forks on the road of the journey to creating a new home. And I believe it's the role of the architect to guide the path, to synthesize ideas and desires into form and solutions, without losing sight of the context and also the cost. And no matter if the budget is large or small, it's usually not big enough. And clients tend to like to spend money on things they can see and can touch. So in a home, they, artisanal finishes, state-of-the-art kitchens, luxurious bathrooms. But it's the role of the architect, and especially in the situation that we find ourselves right now, to remind of the importance to invest into substance, to invest into building systems that are resilient, that are sustainable, and that will perform well over time. So I feel the horrific events of the fires in the Palisades and Altadena created a public awareness for resilience and the need to rethink. And I expect that this will make our clients more susceptible to see value in investing into substance.
Thank you. Tina, Slovenia is so similarly vulnerable as Los Angeles, right? How do people navigate risk there? Like, are they open? It's like, what's the state of climate resilient building?
Yeah, great question. Yeah, Slovenia is a tiny yet highly diverse. It's earthquake-prone territory with intensified natural disasters in the last years, meaning floods and wildfires. So we can reconnect with the idea of Los Angeles. Of course, on one side, we have the Alpine region, which is very similar to Austria, where torrential rain has caused extreme devastating floods in 2023, in Austria 2024, where landslides affected thousands of homes, and national emergency was actually called upon. But let's say a region that is more resembling the LA condition is the karst region of Slovenia. It's the region on the border to Italy. It's a distinctive limestone plateau with Mediterranean climate. And its major characteristics are higher temperatures, dry and dense vegetation, with pine trees and shrubs. As fun fact, most of the oak trees were cut to build foundations of Venice. And on top of that, because of the lack of vegetation a couple of hundred years ago, the intensity of strong winds becomes even stronger. Or intensified. So in 2022, we had this kind of the biggest, largest wildfire in the history of independent Slovenia. This means in the last 35 years. And this is actually very similar if we try to compare it to the LA fire. It was, of course, here the cause. They attributed it to the sparks of the breaking train, and then it was so dry and this kind of strong gusts of winds, very hard terrain to navigate and so on. And of course, also some remains of the World War I were there, so there were explosions on that site. But what is really interesting, I tried to imagine what do we learn from that? So luckily, most of this wildfire was happening in the forestry, not in the villages of the karst. But if we look, and luckily we have been practicing in that region, we are now relearning how to build with stone. And actually, stone as being resilient and locally sourced. Our karst house actually used the stone that was excavated on the ground and was used actually for the facade. And of course, stone shingles were those who are usually protecting those houses from the fires that might come from the vegetation back to this kind of very densely condensed villages. And I think in this, let's say, in this region, which is, so we have to address these natural disasters and resilient building differently in the region that it's more Mediterranean or Alpine, because the floods define different type of resilience and the fire, a different type of resilience. But I think we should not underestimate the traditional building techniques, because they were not only that they are something that identify the region, define the character of the region, But of course, they honored the local resources, the material which was in abundance. In the case of karst, it was the stone. And then those were all proven and tested in order to be resilient. So I think also, let's say in terms of, so I think those are the learning moments that we should be addressing also today.
You talk about nature. It's like, Dana, we're sitting, like Los Angeles is an interesting city. It's a metropolis that sits in wilderness, essentially. It's like, so we have negotiated, right? This treacherous wilderness urban interface. Like, people want to live in nature and with nature, but is it time to rethink that?
Yeah. Well, first of all, the wilderness urban interface is the fastest growing zone in the US. And I live in that zone, and many of our projects are in that zone. So we've been thinking about this for a long time, and I would say that this is, in the conditions, the treacherous conditions are at odds with the kind of tenets of California modernism, right? Blurring the boundaries between indoor and outdoor, as Southern California is known for, and many people come here for that kind of outdoor living. It puts us in peril, right? And so, I think it's time to question everything. I will say that there is no bulletproof solution to fire danger. I mean, we've seen that certainly in the Palisades is not really a vulnerable area. In fact, my aunt and uncle have lived there 45 years. And I negotiated their insurance this year, which is very frightening for me. But they live in zone 0, which is the lowest fire risk, and they are right next to the high school that burned, So I think it's not just that zone. I think these are black swans. These are events that we can't even predict, right? And then the last thing I will say, which I think is interesting, especially to the interface, is that the number one fire resilience issue facing homeowners, institutions, and utility companies is maintenance, right? So Los Angeles, we imagine as kind of, especially as architects and urbanists, we see as a collection of private enclaves, right? That's kind of the fabric that we know. But landscape is inevitably contiguous. Soil and water systems, habitats, and for sure flames don't recognize property lines, And as a result, we are dependent on our neighbors' diligence in maintaining their property and our city's vigilance also in doing their part. And in all of these ways, I definitely think it is time to rethink everything.
Mm-hmm. That's a really nice segue. Thank you. Because Mark, it's like my question for you is, one home is only as safe as the home next door.
100%.
It's exactly that. So can we bring people along to living this? It's like we are so focused on our sort of single family home, if you want, but realizing that the responsibility is like does not stop there, but we're responsible for those around us. So Mark, what are your thoughts about that?
Well, I think it's a big educational task to get people to think of different models. And in an urban fire like this, which caused so much destruction, and also it is in everybody's mind, but also it goes out of the news circle pretty quickly. We in Los Angeles feel it probably very closely because it's in the air, it's on the beaches, and it's not just affecting your neighborhood. Like I live in Venice, which is like down from the fire, but the beaches are closed, the water supply is not there. So it gives, it's really disastrous. Like, and if you think of urban fires, like the big Chicago fire in late 1800s or 1900s, that also displaced about 150,000 people and burned for 2 days. And so, what can we learn from these disasters? I mean, in California, it was always like, oh, it's nice here, but it's disaster land. You know, you have the fire, like there are postcards. What are the seasons of Los Angeles? Oh, it's fire, it's riots, and earthquakes, and what's left? You know,
Mudslides.
flood. Yeah, but
Mudslides.
yes.
Yeah.
So it's really a very everybody comes in here already a little bit with that mindset that there is this danger out there. But everybody also thinks it's not my problem, you know, it's not me. I'm not gonna get it. So there's this big hope. So I think the question of how do you get out new models of community, new models of living together, new models with living with the landscape, all that there's an opportunity now to revise it or to at least try to, because the politics of this is always very anti-change, like the rush to build, the building codes get lightened, the planning codes get, oh, we just do it the same it was. That's the easiest way, but it's thanks to the long time it will take to even clean up the sites, you know, that people even can go back to really be part of it. That's an opportunity to think of new models of not only building resilient, but also building maybe, you know, more dense in more commercial areas. Like in the Palisades village, even commercial buildings were only one-story commercial. There was no mixed use of apartments. I think bigger buildings also can be more fire resistant and so forth. So all of that needs, hopefully it's up for grabs, but I don't, you know, it's hard to tell what will stick. But as many people will not rebuild, there are opportunities.
Yeah, you're right about that. But yeah, it's like the tendency to loosen regulations so people can come in quickly is a counterproductive one. I would like to move on to sort of risk management, materials and building design, right? That's sort of integral if we talk about resilient buildings, like what can we do better? So Andre, my first question is to you, is like, what does it take to design actually a climate resilient and fire resistant building?
Well, I guess first of all, exercise open-mindedness, not follow the convention of, you know, how we did things before, rethink. And I mean, at the base of, you know, starting to think about the new building, you have to start with the site. You know, the qualities of the site, the topography, but also, you know, prevailing wind patterns, etc. So the orientation of the building is relevant, the volume, the shape of the building, of course, the materiality of the building, detailing of the building elements. So all these components and, you know, all the way to landscaping are all going to be, so it's the combination of all. And I think what we saw during the firestorm that newer construction tended to perform maybe a little bit better. And this is definitely contingent to just also updated building codes over the time. And, you know, with, you know, having sprinklers or, you know, more fire resistive construction. But we saw in this firestorm, that the temperatures got so high that even the rebar inside of concrete walls melted. So I think it's kind of like what Dana just said, and also Marco, we all said that in reality, it's like you can strive to build a very fire-resistant structure, but that will have a better chance for survival. But there need to be collective measures for improvements that make neighborhoods overall more resilient. And I think Dana had a really excellent point that resilience can be provided by, you know, construction, but it also can only only be achieved with the proper maintenance.
Mark, a passive house, right? Quote unquote passive house in the Palisades was the only one that survived in its neighborhood. And it's the antithesis of the California dream of living in nature, as we already talked about. So do you think that can find adoption?
Yeah, I think, it probably the passive house as it defined as an airtight, highly insulated, mechanically ventilated building might not exactly fit the California mode, but it is like a variation of that can surely be more accommodated, and especially if you add sort of maybe fire resistancy to the exterior, which is not part per se of the passive house. But also, I just met a woman who was displaced, and now she lives in Venice with her children, and they had a concrete roof. She didn't know if it was, a green roof or it was just a concrete roof, but it survived. So there are examples of houses which are tight and do not have extreme overhangs or have which is also a little bit contradictory, because like you want to have shade, so the houses have a lot of overhangs, so that overhang becomes a kind of fire tunnel to catch fire into the air holes of the building. So and then I think there's also, we have to think about the toxicity of the buildings themselves, because they are, right now we're building with materials which either burn badly or are really recovering badly after sort of the cleanup. So on one hand, we all kind of, not everybody, I mean, Los Angeles actually needs a little more concrete. I have a bumper sticker, hunk for concrete, but there is, everything is built so light, and so like it's almost like kindling, to a fire. It doesn't really prevent it. So definitely there are measures, individual measures, which can be taken. But again, I think there's a sort of communal aspect to this when a whole community goes up in fire. And so one knee-jerk rejection is always, make the streets wider so the fire engines can turn, because there was a lot of congestion, people getting out of the area, the fire departments can go in, or improve the fire department, improve the building material. All of it will help, but I think where can we hook in immediately and make this better? You bury the electric lines, yes, that would be one step. But also, I think there are, like I just saw an example in Japan, they have a municipal sprinkler system which covers the whole area because they have wooden roofs, and it's a historic thing. So huge sprinklers cover the roofs. So what can be done on an infrastructure communally which could prevent like risk areas more? But the bigger thing also is, economically, the insurance rates will go up for everybody in California, and that will become a problem for a lot of people. And what is the way how we think of this kind of mechanism which we are so used to, like insurance or replacement, and those things will also undergo changes. They will not be the same, and people have to either save up or make sort of communal efforts to create communal insurances or block insurances among themselves.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, that's where the California Fair Plan. It's funny that you say hunk for concrete. We would never say that in Austria.
I know. It's
What do you think? So, Tina, talking about toxic materials or using something else, you work with Atelier Luma in France, right? And they practice farm to building architecture, which is a great term, or bioregional design. So they use locally sourced organic methods of construction, and you do the same in your own work. I would love for you to talk more about that.
Sure. I think this question is connected also what Mark just said. No, I mean, in Europe, we are so anti-concrete now that we are trying to use more wood, so to become more light and more California-like, and we are not aware of the dangers that it comes with. And of course, trying to find as Atelier Luma, but also through the TU Wien research that we have been doing together with the Biofabric Vienna, trying to find alternative materials which are more sustainable, but of course also imposing this kind of circularity and mostly local production. So basically, for I think we are all aware that for hundreds of years we were building from the material from the region and from the site itself. And we somehow only in probably the last 100 years abolished that. And since the transport became so cheap that we can use every material wherever. But of course, in order to fight that, Atelier Luma is one of those institutions that tackled this kind of bioregional design and explore the producing of the locally defined and researched materials, but not only to research them, but they applied them on a building, on Atelier Luma, which is built. It's a renovation transformation of an existing brick building that belonged to the railway station. And what is interesting when you discuss this with them, that the most important part was actually to show that the new materials, which was algae based or straw based or earth and clay mixtures and so on, were according to the standards that you could build in south of France with. So that was the longest thing to address. And of course, one of those standards is also fire resistance. The salt experiment is used in the Gary building, which is not Atelier Luma, but Luma as the museum itself. So what did we do in Biofabric, which was part of the climate biennial last year in Vienna? We were trying to rethink bioregional waste in the Vienna area. And then by employing hands-on methodology with our students, we tried to explore materials and the constructive processes. But in order to, of course, come up, and we did come up with 15 new potential materials, which should be further tested. And we did large one-to-one mock-ups. But it's not only to build more resilient and sustainable, but also to reintroduce the identity through the materiality. And this is something that we have been exploring in our practice, the Kleva Grigoric architects, for more than 2 decades, because you need really to build the identity to the people where they live with the materials and with the typology on many levels. So I think what is really interesting in this case, it's yes, we are trying to understand the resilience, not only through the materiality, but also through the durability of the building. So also with the robustness of buildings, which is also relevant for the fires, and monolithic or kind of simple design technology. So rather back to build a very thick wall, which will sustain the fire, and not to have like 10 layers of different, very, the new materials, which are according to the codes, but are actually very problematic from the sustainability perspective. So these are some of the directions that we are opening up within the practice, but of course also within the TU Wien.
Yeah, super interesting. Julia, you have long worked with innovative technologies and thought about all kinds of things. It's like, and you have a lot of experience with 3D printing, right? We've really pushed the boundaries there. How does it work, and what are the promises and issues with 3D printing structures?
Well, I think this is a very broad and big topic, which I'm very happy to give some feedback here. I agree with what Tina and Mark were saying. I think that the path forward to a sustainable future is that we rethink how we currently extract toxic materials and how we rethink current construction methods and towards a more circular, bio-based and sustainable materials and methods for construction, but also not only for buildings, but also what materials and what performances these materials have. So I think this is the one side. The other side is when we look at other parts, like, for example, the current global plastic production is about 445 million metric tons by 2025. So it's enormous amount of plastic which is produced already there and goes all in our oceans and is all waste. So looking at these kind of materials which are already existing, how we could perhaps research how we reuse those and how we recycle them and repurpose them for using them in construction. And I want to bring like two examples, one for temporary housing and one for more permanent housing with 3D printing construction. I recently went with my UCLA students to visit our sewer printed homes, which is here in Los Angeles. They produce temporary housing. Also now they have some kind of requests for temporary housing shelter for some people who lost their homes. And they are the first company which robotically 3D prints with plastic waste. And they print a house it's a tiny home within like 24 hours. They outfit it within 6 days. So it's an extremely fast construction. They are much cheaper and they're more sustainable. And they, in one house unit, for example, they use 150,000 recycled water bottles, where they add fire-resistant additives into the plastic. And it's actually twice as long fire-resistant than wood. So if we compare it to a lot of the wood constructions which burned down, it's already like more resistant. Of course, it doesn't meet the requirement of what Andrea was earlier saying, that rebar was melting in the concrete. So this is an extreme scenario, but it is one way to rethink, for example, wooden construction. And I also don't think that, I think that it is time to think what kind of materials are already existing and how could we repurpose them. The other example is for more permanent construction, a startup which also only exists about 5 years. It's all started in the last 5 years. Icon, it's a Texas-based company, Icon Built. They 3D print with concrete. Their approach is towards affordable housing. It only becomes cheaper in the construction once you build, let's say, houses in the hundreds. So they focus on like tiny homes, on communities. And we did a competition entry for the Initiative 99, where we designed duplexes, small tiny home units for under $99,000. And they're around 400 square feet, so really small. But what comes with the 3D printing is that the design and the aesthetic is kind of something which comes for free. And so you can, even for affordable housing, you can design really beautiful communities. And this kind of ability to design innovative and sustainable and resilient structures is one way which just sets it apart from other kind of prefabricated methods. And lastly, so this is for more like permanent structures. And lastly, towards Los Angeles has a lot of old buildings also, especially in downtown, not in comparison to Austria, where like buildings are hundreds of years old, but here we have a lot of houses and high rises, especially, which are between 50 to 70 years old. And so they were all like built in ways and methods which don't come up to current standards in seismic coding. So they undergo a lot of seismic retrofitting, but equally they don't perform climatically anymore to these new temperatures which we have and the heat waves we have. And so one thing we research with UCLA students is how could we design retrofitted facades, lightweight facades of 3D printed panels which can be easily replaced, and which could help those buildings to have shading and cooling, and therefore not necessarily need so much air conditioning, so much energy, and could rethink ground up construction and rather rethinking how you can retrofit existing buildings. So I think these are some of the kind of ideas from a 3D printing perspective. I think there was one more question what you had, Alexandra, which was about how readily available is it, or like how mainstream is it? Well, there are those companies which are currently existing who provide these and offer these methods. And when we look at the perspective of the growth market of 3D printing, it's enormous and huge. And so I think that there's definitely a future for us to look at these construction methods.
It's only just beginning.
Also, just to chime in a little bit, there's a big kind of modular industry which came out of the, let's say, mobile homes and GI Bill after the Second World War. That created an incredible, popular, I mean, on a lower scale, like housing situation, which were copied after, ranch-style housing and things like that. But there are modular building things. They come, maybe they're produced room by room, or half room added on to it. So this is where the prefabrication has gone, but also there was this whole, I think, missed opportunity to go for a sort of lower scale market. Now all the prefabricated homes and modular homes are aimed for sort of like richer people who have an environmental guilt and want to build their second or third home in a more resilient and more green way. But it hasn't come down to what we call to the sort of lower standards.
For the housing market. Yeah, although there are people who are trying to ramp that up too, and sort of build apartment buildings for people of lesser means. Dana, it's like circling back to the vegetation question, right? It's like and like the role of vegetation landscape design in fire resilience. It's like you started talking about that a little bit before, but I wanted to come back to that and think about that, how that can be used strategically.
Yes. Well, first, I heard this fact the other day, which really had an impact on me, that plants make up 80% of the living mass on Earth, which is like something so big. And I think there's something like, I mean, there are millions of species of plants, and each one has its own characteristics. So within the over 6,000 plant species found in Los Angeles, some present greater fire risk than others, and that's due to their innate characteristics. So flammability being one, the chemical makeup, we know eucalyptus trees contain resin, which causes them to explode. And there are amazing stories about plant behavior in this way. Other characteristics are branch structure, and something I've been looking into is leaf shape. So even the geometry of plants and trees has a lot to do with the risk that they present. In the case of I think it was the Paradise Fire, the avocado leaves, it was 75% of the structures burned because when avocado leaves dry, they cup. And this kind of three-dimensional dried form creates so much danger, much more than a leaf, say, that dries flat. And so how, we use, let's say, in our projects, just as an example, we're doing a housing project for veterans, and it is a modular project, which kind of tacks on to the conversation that Mark and even Julia were sort of introducing. But we have on that site 13,000 individual plants, right? And to create stability of the slope and the soil, we use a multitude of plants because we know that with blights or bugs or other things, extinction, certain plants die. So the more plants you have, the more likely you are to have root systems that knit together to protect the hillside. But it is absolutely true that all plants will burn under the right conditions. So regardless of how they are classified, they will burn. And it leads us to the kind of the same thing we began with, which is that maintenance can have a bigger impact on the flammability of plants than the species itself. So with that said, great care still needs to be taken in determining which plants to use and how to position them, how to space them, how to create fire breaks. And also just such detail, like a fire ladder can be created by a single tree next to a structure. We're familiar with that, right? But a fire ladder can also be created by a small plant igniting a medium-sized plant, igniting a larger plant or tree with low branches, and then the next thing you know, there's structure fires everywhere. So green roofs also fall into that category. I mean, in a way, they are more fire resistant than typical roofs here in LA. But at the same time, if those green roofs contain weeds or brush, it actually presents greater risk than a regular roof. So I think it's, maintenance, it cannot be understated, the role that maintenance plays.
That's a really good point, yeah. So given where we are and given what's happening all over the world, like it seems like it's time for big ideas, right, in urban design. What are they though? Where should we go? Andreas, like we talked about this, it's like we talked about community, right? It's like sort of what constitutes community, what constitutes the fabric of a community with its grown history and memory. Sort of as the community looks to rebuild, how do we keep this quality front and center, right, in urban design and bring people along with us?
Yeah, I feel that this is probably the trickiest part of the reconstruction effort. I mean, how do we connect to the memory of the place, right? To the buildings, the landscapes that have evolved over decades, and that the community has cherished over that time. So meticulously reconstructing what was there before. I think even with planting mature trees or something, I don't think it will render a copy, it will not bring back, I think, what people are missing. And so there is no chance to bring back an original character. So why not really taking this opportunity to create something new, something that is current, that is responsive to where we are, and you're absolutely right. There has to be a collective approach to this. This is not, a single person's, yard by yard kind of effort. There has to be a bigger vision. I spoke with a homeowner who lost her house the next day, and she said, last night I left with almost nothing, and today I'm basically starting over. And this was, of course, very emotional, but I think it's the core message. We have to start over. This idea of that is floated of rebuilding is what we have. The replica idea. I think this is the wrong direction. We have to start over in an informed way, in a collaborative way, looking at the possibilities that are out there, expanding them, like Julia said, with the 3D printing methods. I'm a little skeptical over the plastic printing, because when this then catches fire, it's even. But I've actually been to the Icon Factory in Austin as well, and it's extremely impressive what is possible in a short amount of time, and also with the opportunity to really react on very specific conditions at this time.
Mark, how can we reshape communities After
Yeah.
this, like you said, like people tend not to come back, right? It's like, or rebuilding costs push them out. But what communal mechanisms would be helpful?
Well, I just remembered, like when I was in school, I studied under Roland Reiner, and he always, brought up kind of statistics. And one of the statistics was economic nomadism in America. In the 70s, American families, moved 5 to 8 times as an upward mobile instrument. They were started with a starter home, moved to or their job opportunities were some. Austrian or Europeans do not move that much. Maybe now the newer generation more, but a house was inherited. You maybe move once in your lifetime and so forth. So there is an opportunity that people are more flexible here in America and or in California and can move into different communal settings like I'm thinking also about Scandinavian models in Denmark, where community living for seniors is heavily promoted, where they have communal kitchens or communal larger areas, but they all live in smaller homes near, not outsourced into the countrysides, but inside the cities where they have other facilities. So a friend of mine is planning right now. He has 2 large lots in Mar Vista, and he's gonna build 8 homes, 8 smaller homes on it, and with a communal aspect as workshops or a guest facility where people who have tinier homes can also have their families come over to stay in that community. I also thinking of some more urban aspects of community, like in Zurich, there are 2 very good projects, the Kalkbreite and Zollhaus developments, which were developed from a community based, and they asked, what are we missing in the community? And one development has even a movie house in it because there was no movie house in that neighborhood. Or they have even some aspects of housing for migrants and definitely for low income people. But I think the community can also choose its community. Like I think, but specifically in Pacific Palisades, there could be definitely in the village flat area much more effort to create a different type of planned community has a very bad meaning here in America, but communities can also be planned or at least started with a plan, and it can develop. And we are much more have much more sophisticated planning instruments than just zoning or building codes to create more interesting and more, let's say, denser and a denser community, because density is also this big kind of NIMBY word here in I don't know if Austrians or if Europeans know the word NIMBY, but it's not in my neighborhood kind of slogan where you just want to don't let strange things happen to us here. So that is something you have to fight a lot in this kind of endeavor, but that there's samples, and we just have to promote these patterns, these samples which exist other words, and talk to politicians or individual developers to I think there's a market for it. It's just there's no variety of development available right now in in Southern California. And that's really what I also miss here, that the sort of public housing, which existed to some extent, and where you were able to plan something for the greater good, has been replaced by more and more privatization, more and more about individualization than before. And it's hard to sort of go back to
Right, but we'll have to go back. That's the advantage of this moment in time and see.
And by the way, I mean, LA has started to think that route before the fires already, right? So there has been changes to the zoning code that encourages multi-mixed, multi-use, and also densification for single-family areas. So.
But people are also more open now, because really we're starting from scratch in so many ways. Tina, is like collective buildings, right? It's like that's something you have thought about for a long time. And can you talk about this? How do they function? What's the intention behind them? Tell us.
Yeah, thank you for the question. And anyway, I'm just continuing where Mark actually ended, because I think that the degree of collectivity and how to build a community has been something that I have actually started as my diploma here in Ljubljana, and then continued at the postgraduate studies at the AA, Architectural Association in London, where we kind of addressed it at the end and published a book called Negotiate My Boundary. What it does, negotiate by boundary, and how is it connected to what we are discussing here? Anyway, all this is connected to my previous research of what was collectivities in the 60s already, not only also in Scandinavia, Italy, and so on, and in Slovenia and all these other countries. But what was interesting in my first diploma is that actually Zarkfabrik, which is a collective, an extraordinary model of collective housing and the best community, is a building that was built in Vienna in the 90s. So I thought as a young student that actually this is the future of affordable collective housing, where the pool is there, where the rooftop gardens are there. I visited that recently with my Toronto students a couple of years ago, and it's incredible how much work it is to kind of maintain the community, but it does work. You know, it works more than 30 years. So Vienna has the prime example of how to live together with this kind of enhanced community and so on. So what we tried to do in Negotiate My Boundaries, push it forward, no, that actually how the question was how to address mass customization of collective housing, but really a degree of collective housing, and how to start to understand that was 20 years ago. So just to set the framework, how to rethink an apartment, that it's not something that needs to have everything. It doesn't need to have equal size kitchen and bedroom and bathroom and this and this and this, because the lifestyles are so completely different. There are people not only in London, but today after 20 years also everywhere else, that they don't cook, and some they cook extensively. So going back to cooperatives, which is actually probably the models that needs to be reconsidered now through the LA perspective, which was mentioned from Zurich, and there are also extremely good versions in Vienna built now. It's exactly this. You come together, and of course also Berlin, you come together as a community of people who want to live together prior to the planning of the building itself. And this is what we anticipated through the digital platforms at the AA in 2002. But actually, this is the only format how to build social integrity before you build the building, that people start to know each other and negotiate and even sign some sort of contracts that they invest themselves in order to then build something, as it was mentioned in Zurich. And maybe in these degrees of collectivity, which this can be very small, 6 units together, why LA is so interesting now for that. We know that every big disaster, including, let's say, an earthquake in Ljubljana in 1895, where 1/3, I guess, or something of Ljubljana was really devastated, this became an opportunity for Jože Plečnik to completely redesign the city itself, that now it's the attention of so many professionals. So basically, I think what it needs to be looked at from such a huge disaster in LA is that maybe now it's a moment where you can acquire a couple of plots together in certain parts which the fire went on, and start to reimagine such a cooperative. And also, to going back to anecdotal discussions before, so imagine all these people that Dana mentioned that now live in an apartment because they all lost their homes. In this moment, there are 3,000-5,000 of people who can form a social agenda, and they all have a similar need in the same time, which is usually in your lifestyle. You have children in different times of your friends, you go to college or whatever, but they know each other from before. They all lost homes, and now they can think 3 or 5 or 6 of them together with the mediator and start to build maybe a version of more experimental retirement community, or a young families with retirees community. But it really allows, this disaster allows an extreme opportunity for new typologies.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you're absolutely right.
Also, I think I have come, I became a grandfather, and my son and his partner moved back in my house. So now it's like a 3-generational house, and you have to new negotiations are going on, but also the cooking, the cleaning, all of this stuff is kind of very now shared and partnered, and it's a very interesting environment. There's always something going on, but there's enough space to recluse. And I think, multi-generational living could also be an aspect which is very relevant, because like one of the biggest complaints we have in the land use meetings here in Venice is that children of people who grew up in Venice, and the children grew up in Venice, they don't have the means anymore to buy in Venice or on the west side. They have to, in order to have a home, they have to move somewhere else. So how can you create even extended community over generations, again, with new types of models of living?
Right, it's an old model of living. In the interest of time, I want to open it up for Q&A. So, first question, everybody. You can unmute yourself, turn on your camera if you want to be seen. Otherwise, you're also welcome to post questions in the chat. Is there any question? Otherwise, I still have lots of questions. Let me ask the first question, and that's actually of Tina. Wood, we talked about wood, right? So in Slovenia, we said it's like 60% of the land of forests, and Austria is a leading producer of wood. And here, all these wood structures burned. So can we engineer wood to be more fire resistant than sort of the current stick-built construction?
Sure, but I think it's two things. No, I think we are usually bluntly talking about wooden structures or non-wooden structure, mainly, let's say, concrete, brick, and so on and so forth. But I think we should, I was thinking through the idea of the fires, and fires becoming, because we have 2 types of fires, one becoming from outdoor, which were the wildfires of LA, and those in the Kars region. But of course, usually we are treating in urban areas the fires coming from indoor. So how not to spread the fire from, starting in one apartment to the next door or so on. So of course, the chemical industry really improved. So like all the treatments of the wood, we can use them now in public infrastructure and public architecture. And we know that it has resistance large enough that everyone can fleet public structures. But going back to, I think in case of wildfires, let's say if we talk for LA specifically, you could still have wooden structure, either massive wooden structure or even it has to be massive. And then it's very important what's the outer layer. Because what I was reading now after this wildfire, it was the material that it's on the roof and on the facade that catched the fire. So it's not either use the wood as structural or not, but it's more important what you put on the roof. So the roofing, that's why I mentioned the stone roofing in the karst area, no? Because when we were doing a contemporary version of a traditional karst house, we introduced the concrete roofing and a concrete slab. But of course, so there, I think there is an opportunity still for wood, but I think it needs to be addressed from the position of wildfires in one region and in another region from another position. So.
Julia.
Yeah, this is really good what you, Tina, bring up in terms of the material on the facades. What I saw a video of like one structure being on fire, and then it was all about which direction the chimney would lean towards. Would it fall inwards or would it fall onto the next house? And the firefighters, they were on location with the owner of the house during the fires. And so it happened that the chimney fell onto the next house. And so they went inside into the attic and they kind of tried, all the firefighters were there and they tried to get rid of the fire, but they weren't able. Like everything was in place. The firefighters were there because there was so much dryness. It hadn't rained for 8 months, and everything was like so much flammable. And the heat and the force of what this fire came with was not like regular fire you would have on an everyday basis, maybe in a house, but it was like really a firestorm. And so even they were there, even they could have like prevented, they weren't able to do anything about it. Everything was so flammable that it immediately catched fire. And so I think this kind of seeing this in this video showed me that I think we talked about this earlier, like you can be prepared so much and you can have so much in rethinking how you build and so on. But with these like new natural disasters, it's just so uncontrollable in a way. So I do think also on the kind of broader spectrum, on the bigger picture, we do have to think how we also live, how we consume, how our global situation is, what we wear, where is that produced, how is it produced, and so on, because I think we have to also work against climate change on a much, much larger scale.
Holistic.
Well, I also want to say that there is an opportunity also for like a new way of seeing architecture in a sense. I mean, that's maybe very far out, but when I look at the 3D printed examples which exist, the sort of the best way to use it is almost like building bubbles in a sense. So we're going back to sort of like a Flintstone-like structures,
Caves,
caves, and things. So it's kind of interesting where that. I'm sure there will be other methods, but right now, even the print icon projects most all of them need some kind of flat roof. And here, right now, the mass stylistic movement is going towards something which happened 50 years ago, like the mid-century, or people want mid-century, that's sort of the common thing. And now, like architects sort of jazz it up a little bit. And then, but I see so many kind of black or anthracite colored houses now, which big windows, boxy design. Of course, that also gets you the most space under the current code. But I think style of living, or how can we live in the future, will it be more fluid, sort of a bubble kind of world, or will it be more a boxy world? That's also interesting to me with all these new material and methods coming up. And so we have to, there is a time lag, will take another 50 years and we all live in caves again. But anyway, it's an interesting journey coming up.
I had a question for the panel and for everyone here, something I'm interested in, and just starting to look into more and more. But what about wet wood? I mean, the thing with the wood is that when it burns, it's not as toxic, as some of the recycled materials that we're talking about. And we've heard about the sprinklers, the kind of communal sprinkler systems in Japan. And there's a system that I find really interesting, connected to our work here in LA, which siphons water out of pools to create irrigation on the roof, really to water the building. But in the scheme of things, knowing that there is no bulletproof solution and everything will burn at some point, as we've seen, is wet wood a viable way forward for protection and resilience?
Well, there's just not enough around, because I was involved in building a building out of sinker. It was called sinker redwood, and it was found in the rivers in Oregon. And it was heavier than water, and it sank to the ground, and over centuries it absorbed more and more water. It was very heavy, and it was totally flame resistant. Because it had so much water content, and the molecule structure kind of changed, that it kept this wetness in a sort of more humid coastal environment. So yeah, I mean, there's probably a future of that, but then it has to be industrial wetness, and I don't know how you sort of create this kind of industry.
But what about, and again, I mean, it impacts like load, of course, because I don't know, but what if you had a way to sense a fire coming, which certainly a house, a smart home could do, and that you would detect and you would water your house, whether you were home or not? Would that be viable, whether it's single family homes or communal living? Or I wanted to mention that planned communities, as a dirty word here, we see projects coming in as intentional communities. It's now seems to be the accepted language here.
Well, in the Altatina fire, I think 8 people died trying to wet their homes. And so it is a method, but with the garden hose, it's not always possible. So
Andrea.
I think also, Dana, what could be really interesting is to look at bioreceptive concrete, like where there has been some research done with 3D printing concrete with seeds inside, so plants grow on the structure itself. And I think also materials which can soak up moist and therefore are like more wet for a longer period of time. So I think that there is definitely an opportunity for innovative materials here. See Erin here. Hi, Erin.
Hi, can you hear me now? Hi, how are you? So I have a question. I noticed there's been like a really interesting conversation about resiliency through material-based problems or material-based solutions. I noticed one thing that I think maybe wasn't brought up as much is performance-based solutions, because, I have seen 3D printed facade systems that have passed the NAPFA testing because they had an intumescent spray foam essentially in them. And there are other like glue lams and other, lumber and other wood-based technologies that are able to make fire ratings. But you can also have, a stone cladding that's based on like FRP brackets that do not have fire resiliency. So I guess my question is, how can we move more to a, performance-based resiliency and use, a lot of the technologies we have at hand to analyze these, rather than just facing on materiality? And like, how can we start to implement that on like a larger, code-based or, planning-based system to have resiliency that allows for a little bit more design flexibility?
Yeah, I think this is super interesting thought. What was this performance-based one you said with stone? stones?
Yeah, just thinking about like fire resiliency on like, the built on a building base level, maybe not community, is looking at ways to like analyze fire performance rather than focusing on individual materials. Because even if you have like a stone cladding that's set on like an FRP bracket system, that might not be a fire resilient system. It might have a certain degree of resiliency as to not catching stray embers, but ultimately, if you had like a firestorm situation, it might combust faster and not allow residents to have time to leave. So I think that there's a lot of really interesting, analysis technologies that let you look at how, heat is transferred in a facade system. And in the same way that we're looking at that for like thermal performance to meet,
Yeah, and you're pointing towards the fact that, for example, Pacific Palisades is a fire. I think Dana brought this up earlier that it was a
Yeah.
fire zone 0, but actually I think the majority of Pacific Palisades is a fire area, and that's why insurances didn't insure the houses anymore. And last September, so many homeowners lost their insurances because insurances said they're not going to insure anymore.
The hillsides.
So I think what you were pointing towards, Erin, is were there any firestorm calculations or visualizations or simulations performed in order to predict how fire would, what would happen in, I don't know anything about that, but it's a really
Yeah.
interesting question. I'm sure there are tools out there to simulate that, and I wonder if the fire department ever does use simulation, but it's a really good, yeah.
Yeah, and it's like maybe not was there, but like could there be? And looking at maybe like reducing insurance costs or allowing houses that aren't insurable to be insurable. Like I'm working with one software to look at thermal transfer called Voltra, which does like fire analysis. And I know that, to make buildings to, ensure compliance in regions like Boston, where there's really high thermal performance, we're now looking at like 3D analysis to start to see if the buildings are able to meet
That's really
guidelines based on performance. So I think it might be an interesting way to look forward is to use technology to make like, to system-based or performance-based systems that still allow like a high degree of like design flexibility rather than trying to look at like material systems as a way to, or to start to, pull specific materials into code rather than performance.
I think that's a really good
Yeah.
point because it's really about the assembly, right? It's not just about, like you said, like a stone-clad facade that has like an air gap behind will perform just as bad as some wood-clad facade. So looking at the overall performance and looking at assemblies and improving the performance of assemblies is definitely a very hands-on, immediate thing that we can all do.
Well, especially in America, everything is about money. So if insurance, like you find now when you reinsure your house, they ask you, do you have a metal roof, or do you have this, do you have that? And I think if that gets tied in with insurance, and so there's an incentive to to make better, constructed homes for sure. I think it has to be like from that sort of point of money that you can save on insurance or be insured. The same thing as infrastructure bonuses and solar bonuses and stuff like that will go in that direction, and maybe those are the changes which get rewarded.
Esteemed panel, we're almost out of time. Last thoughts on the topic?
Maybe it's not a last talk, but it's something which was regarded before. I think in Europe, there is this kind of approach that you actually look through assemblies, not only through materials. And with Grenfell fire in London, we are all aware of those things again. And I think what we should really not look into, we should be looking in more robust ways to build, either a temporary shelter or a robustness that it's actually resilient in general. And of course, that's why I mentioned before a hybrid approach where actually it's not about the stone facade, but actually it's about maybe building with stone again, because this is actually a lot of experimentation has been done, and also building has been built where a structural stone is used or concrete for the outside. But of course, inside, this is what we did in the karst region. It's actually, we used the wood. And this would also allow, Julia, where the chimney of the neighboring house would fall on our house, would nothing happen because the structure of the roofing was also concrete. But with our two small projects that we did in US, we know that building with concrete is really not as advanced as it in Europe. And it's very hard to get people who are able to do that. And I think therefore, it's more interesting to really look at what US can offer, either in 3D printing or in other ways, in order to build this robust walls and structures, and then use wood in other ways. And also adding to Dana, I think there are also other non-chemical treatments to the wood. And most ecological, it's the thermal treatment that you actually in thermal kind of way prepare, kind of higher the fire resistance of the wood when you put the wood in some sort of very kind of conditions, pre-fire conditions before it's installed in the building. So I think we should not be against one or the other material, but we should really find solutions that would actually work as a whole for a specific region with specific disasters at hand, and in together with how you live in those places, but also the climate, the natural, and of course, relationship to the outdoor. And so it's a complex situation and complex things that we cannot answer today, but I think it was interesting, or I learned a lot. I learned intentional community term. I'm going to use it from now on.
But also it's ironic that when you burn wood, pre-burn wood, like you're creating a crust on the wood, and it becomes much more fire resistant. So it would be
did that, right? There's a Japanese technique that
yeah. But also right now there's a trend with this dark building that I've seen houses here which have like pre-burned siding on it, and I don't think it's if you do it like that, it will be really fire resistant. But there's a sort of interesting metaphor that you have to burn your building to be fire resistant.
Well, controlled burns.
Burn your building, not only the landscape.
So everybody, thank you very much. This was an incredible conversation, and we could go on all day and longer probably thinking about this. Thank you everybody who joined us today for this conversation, who tuned in from truly all over the world. It's really magnificent. So thank you, and we may pick this up again at some other time.
Thank you for putting this together, Alexandra. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I've learned so much, so thank you.
Nice to see you all. Thanks for everyone who joined.
Bye now.
Bye.
Bye-bye.